Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova. Rabbis delivering sermons on the high holidays is nothing new. It's a practice that dates back generations, sharing words of Torah on these days of awe. Perhaps what might be at least a little bit new, though, is the attention that's given to them, almost as a kind of institution. Every year, there are articles asking how rabbis prepare for these days, and then follow up discussing any feedback to what they've said. Just this morning, the New York Jewish Week email newsletter offered a summary of several different sermons from Rosh Hashanah, as well as highlighted their coverage of rabbis' high holiday sermons dating back some 100 years. Additionally, in advance of the holidays this year, the New York Times ran a feature on a so-called sermon coach who helps about 24 rabbis craft their messages and hone their deliveries. And this past week, the Rabbinical Assembly shared a call for submissions from a graduate student who was writing a thesis on the art and institution of high holiday sermons and looked to collect many examples for analysis. Now, all of this is to say there are certain expectations for high holiday sermons. They should be intellectual, yet accessible, inspirational without being preachy, sometimes political, but not partisan, and they should make people feel good about themselves while encouraging them to strive to do more. And most importantly, they should be around, but never exceed 20 minutes. For several weeks leading up to the holidays, people always ask me some version of, Rabbi, how are the sermons coming? And I have my usual, not too descriptive answer. Oh, they're not quite there yet, but I'm feeling good about them. They'll be ready. But just this past Friday night, right before Shabbat services began, I was asked the same question and surprised myself and gave a little bit of a different answer. I said that I was mostly ready, but that I also had a new idea just earlier that afternoon. The person responded, "That's dangerous." Well, Josh, that was dangerous, because as I thought about the sermon I had written at that point, I realized it probably checked all the boxes that it needed to, but it was mostly fine. This new idea excited me a lot more. And so since Yom Kippur is a time to ask for forgiveness, I hope you'll forgive me. I hope tonight's sermon still checks most of those boxes, and that you won't mind if it's a little bit short of that 20-minute mark. Yom Kippur, like most holidays, is an occasion with a few names. We generally translate it to be the Day of Atonement. But its second name in the Torah is Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Each year, we tend to spend a lot of time and focus on the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But the most sacred occasion on our calendar is also our most frequent. It's Shabbat. So on this day of Shabbat Shabbaton, that's what I want to talk about. The Hebrew writer and early Zionist thinker Achad Ha'am famously said, "More than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews." We're used to talking about keeping Shabbat, but it really is Shabbat that has been keeping us. For generations, Shabbat has sanctified our time, it has defined our communities, and ultimately encouraged us to rely on each other, no matter the moment in history. We're generally familiar with the basics of Shabbat. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So to commemorate this, the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, teaches us that we too should rest on Shabbat in appreciation of the way that God rested. "You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to God. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dorotam berit olam. The Israelite people shall keep Shabbat, observing Shabbat throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. Later on, the rabbis of the Talmud explain in great detail what it means to observe a day of rest, and in a way that only the rabbis of the Talmud can, they identify 39 general types of labor that we should avoid. Things like tanning a piece of leather and weaving on a loom. It is admittedly complicated and very technical, so much so that the rabbis themselves describe the laws of Shabbat as hararim hatluyin b'se'ara. They are as mountains hanging by a thread. When we think about Shabbat today, we oftentimes stop there. These are the laws of what you can and can't do. But there's another way to think about it. We spend so much time thinking about what Shabbat is that we sometimes miss what Shabbat does. Not only is Shabbat a celebration each week, but it is also a solution to some of the biggest challenges we face at the present moment. On Rosh Hashanah, I spoke at length about the loneliness epidemic impacting our country. Shabbat is one potential cure. It's not just an opportunity, but an encouragement to seek out connection each week. For some, that connection is found among a community here in synagogue, where we need each other to offer our prayers. For others, it's with friends and family at home, around a dinner table, lingering over a special meal without rushing off to our next commitment. For still others, it's meeting friends in a park or elsewhere in nature, building connections to each other and to the natural world. Wherever it is, Shabbat is our time to celebrate together. That's not to say every moment of Shabbat needs to be spent with people. It is perhaps the most appropriate day to be alone and refresh our bodies and spirits. In a world that's becoming more digital and connected, it's more important than ever to find occasions to set all of that aside. As I usually say at the beginning of our services, we ask that we turn off all of our electronic devices. When else do we get to do that? Not have to do that. When else do we get to do that? When else can we say, I'm not available for this call, and I'm not responding to this email, it'll have to wait. It's a time when we don't have to care who posted what online or what the latest controversy of the day is. Shabbat helps us recover and refresh from all the matters that fill our attention during the week. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the most important thinkers and theologians of the conservative movement, wrote extensively about Shabbat and commented, "It is one of life's highest rewards, a source of strength and inspiration to endure tribulation, to live nobly." It is part of Heschel's brilliance to suggest that Shabbat is a way to live nobly. Living in a way that demonstrates our values each week is something we can aspire to. But I think the outlook of our present moment heightens this example in a way that Heschel likely did not intend at first, but in a way that captures the spirit of some of his most notable writings. In June of 1963, 2 months before the March on Washington, I guess I've been reading a lot about that summer recently, Heschel was invited by President Kennedy to attend a meeting of religious leaders discussing the growing racial tensions in the country. Accepting that invitation, Heschel sent a telegram to Kennedy saying, "Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare a state of moral emergency. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity." That last phrase, moral grandeur and spiritual audacity, eventually became the title of a collection of Heschel's essays and evolved into a summary of much of his philosophical outlook. While he used it here as part of a call for racial reckoning, it speaks to us today as a call to embrace Shabbat. I've spoken several times about our concerns of rising anti-Semitism, so much so that it's difficult to keep addressing in new ways. This year, all of those trends have sadly continued. I'm sure most of you saw the news that dozens of synagogues have been the targets of bomb threats in recent weeks, including several on Rosh Hashanah. Thankfully, none of them have been credible. This so-called swatting is just the latest in a series of hateful attempts to scare Jews away, to make our sanctuaries, our safe spaces, seem unsafe, to try and force us to leave our identities behind. How do we respond to these continued efforts? With our own moments of spiritual audacity, to say, no, you cannot scare us away. This is who we are. It's who we are and who we are proud to be, and let us show that by embracing one of these core mitzvot, these core traditions that has kept us together for generations. You will never keep us from celebrating Shabbat and making it an important part of our lives. Today, marking Shabbat each week takes on an air of religious disobedience. Here's something they don't want us to do, we're going to do it anyway. I wish it were not the case. I wish Shabbat could just be our day to rest and refresh. But today, Shabbat must also be our day to resolve, to stand up and say, this is who we are. This is who we have been, and this is who we will continue to be. Embracing our oldest mitzvah, one that has been a vital part of Jewish identity for all of Jewish history. That does not mean we all need to observe Shabbat in the same way or in the strictest sense. I know that's not for everyone, and no, I don't expect to see you all back here this Friday. Don't get me wrong, it would be great, but I understand if it's not realistic. Still, we cannot fall into the trap of thinking about Shabbat as all or nothing. Like so many aspects of our tradition, there is a wide array of ways that we can mark Shabbat in our lives. For some, that will mean being together with our kehillah. For others, that might mean lighting candles at home to mark Shabbat's beginning and end. Whichever of those it may be, or even it's something else entirely different, I hope that we can all appreciate Shabbat as that way to refresh ourselves, and also as the show of pride in our Jewish identity, stating proudly on Shabbat, Hineni, here I am. The Talmud teaches that Shabbat is equivalent to 1/60th of Olam Haba, of the world to come, a small taste of paradise where our earthly concerns are left aside. Today, Yom Kippur is Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, and that is precisely our mindset on this day too. We strive today to not be concerned with our physical selves. We refrain from eating and drinking because we're fully engrossed in our spirits and our sacred moments. Now, don't worry, that's not part of Shabbat. In fact, it's just the opposite. But so many aspects of this day do carry over, depending on each other, singing together, disconnecting from the day-to-day business of the rest of our weeks, and stating proudly, this is who we are. The drama of Yom Kippur is that our fates hang in the balance. Our years have not yet been sealed. Throughout this day, we will confess where we have fallen short, but let us also commit to where we can grow. We each have areas for personal growth, but I hope we use this Yom Kippur to commit to Shabbat as an area of communal growth. That will mean something different for every person in this room, but I hope that it can mean something to each of us. Let this taste of the world to come, however small it might be something that we can turn back to and build on each week. It was 125 years ago, at one of the earliest Zionist gatherings, that Echad Ha'am spoke about Shabbat keeping the Jews. What he really meant is that without Shabbat as a regular part of our observances and celebrations, our communities likely would have faded away. But with our commitments on this day, on this Yom Kippur, we know that we will continue to keep Shabbat, and that Shabbat will ultimately continue to keep us together as proud Jews for so many more years to come. Gmar Chatima Tova.